Every community has their own stories and urban legends. This was the case with the town I live in, where I attend college. The town has a regional natural history center, whose most popular exhibit is Emile the Doll. According to the exhibit, the doll was gifted to the youngest daughter of the Jardin family, who lived in the town during the early 20th century. The girl, who named the doll Emile, quickly grew attached to it and even had Emile with her when the family took their last photograph together. In the following days, nobody saw or heard from the Jardins. When the neighbors went to their home, they found all 7 members dead. Their faces were missing or butchered beyond recognition, and despite a thorough investigation, no culprit was ever found. Days later, the photographer who took the Jardin family's last picture together went insane. He destroyed his photography equipment, stabbed his fiancée in the face over 40 times, and set fire to his own. Before succumbing to his injuries in the hospital, he rambled on about being followed by the doll, which was discovered in his house, and its burning hatred of being photographed. The story quickly spread through the region, and the doll mysteriously disappeared from the police station. It supposedly changed hands a few times over the next 50-60 years, before publicly resurfacing in 1991, when the Regional Natural History Center announced the doll was in its possession and going to be put on display. A local journalist was given exclusive access to the exhibit before its unveiling and took several photographs of Emile, hoping to disprove the stigma surrounding the doll. The journalist slipped down an embankment and broke both their legs after leaving the Natural History Center. When his body was discovered, a group of raccoons, possums, and rats were feasting on the corpse and completely devoured the man's face. It's rumored the autopsy determined he was eaten alive by the animals, but the cause of death was officially ruled to be exposure. The journalist's camera that photographed Emile was never found. The History Center initially canceled the exhibit, but reinstated it in 1995. Video or photography is strictly prohibited, with viewers being required to turn over any devices with cameras before entering the exhibit hall. The History Center claims these policies prevent the doll from deteriorating and for copyright protections. Exhibitors will mostly dismiss Emile's curse as local folklore, but admit the deaths actually happened. I was always fascinated by Emile the Doll and decided to write a research paper on the story for my thesis. I had a few friends who worked or interned at the History Center, and they said they could get me in during after hours to see the doll and even interview the curator, under the condition that I don't take any photos or video. While I agreed to their terms, I still planned on secretly snapping a few pictures. I've always been the persistent type that disregarded the rules and was always willing to go the extra mile. While the photos would be a wonderful touch to my paper, I also lavished at the reactions I would get when I posted them online. My contacts at the History Center either didn't have or weren't friends with me on social media, so I didn't think there'd be any costly consequences. People sneak photographs at these kind of exhibits all the time, I thought, and I could always explain the images I post were replicas of Emile if I ever got into trouble. I arrived around 8:30 that evening after the History Center closed. My friend Russell, who works there as a security guard, instructed me to meet with him at one of the side entrances. I thanked him incessantly for his help as he escorted me through the complex. He said Mrs. Barnes, the History Center's curator, wanted me to interview her first before I visited Emile. I was only able to speak with Mrs. Barnes for about 20 minutes, who spent most of the time suspiciously looking me over, like she sensed my true intentions. She was a tall, older lady with a long face, large, tired brown eyes, and dark gray hair that seemed to match her gray pantsuit. Despite her apprehensive attitude and refusing to let me record our conversation, she provided me with some valuable information on where the doll ended up after its disappearance. Apparently, she herself obtained the doll in 1987, 1 year before becoming the History Center's curator. It was left to her by a lifelong friend after they died, who was a former detective and discovered the doll when investigating a call about an antique collector that was decapitated while trying to install a glass pane in their home. She didn't have much information on the antique collector, but did affirm that the neighbor she got it from died by suicide. When our interview concluded, she gave me her card, but reiterated the History Center's strict policy prohibiting photographing or videotaping Emile, and even called Russell into her office so she could watch as I handed him over my electronics. Even though I acted annoyed and taken back by this, it was something I anticipated and prepared accordingly. Earlier that day, I visited a spy shop and purchased a retractable pen containing a small hidden camera, whose pin you had to push to snap photographs. My plan was to aim the pen at the display and click it a few times, pretend to jot down some notes, and claim the pen was out of ink before swapping it for a real one. Totally foolproof. The room looked like a small lecture hall, with a few rows of elevated seats that formed a semicircle in front of the display case containing Emile. The room's walls were littered with excerpts of writings explaining the doll's history, along with photographs of the Jardin family, other purported victims, and even newspaper clippings detailing the deaths that were supposedly tied to the doll. Emile was encased in a glass box in the center of a small elevated platform surrounded by 4 stanchions. The doll was positioned standing upright and comprised of soft whitish-beige fabric. It wore a pair of charcoal-colored trousers, a matching frock coat, and white dress shirt that was surprisingly detailed considering its age and size, along with a pair of small black shoes. The doll's facial features looked completely faded, with vague impressions representing where the eyes, nose, and mouth would have been. The doll's entire face was marked up by about 4 or 5 dark reddish-brown stitches resembling scars across its forehead, down the front of its face and along its sides. While eerie in appearance, the doll emanated a sort of neglectful, sorrowful aura that almost made me pity it, despite its fearsome reputation dwelling in the back of my mind. "Just hurry up and do what you gotta do," Russell said as we walked up to the display case. "Mrs. Barnes wants the place cleared out before we make our final rounds. I just want to jot a few notes, maybe browse through some of the written displays quickly," I replied as I withdrew the spy pen from my pack and nonchalantly clicked it a handful of times before I pretended to realize it was out of ink. "Can you give me 5-10 minutes?" "Probably can only do 5, Russell replied as I swapped pens and jotted some notes. "Mrs. Barnes was initially against this, so I don't want to take her flexibility for granted." I conducted a circular inspection of Emile and quickly skimmed the writings in the room, which didn't tell me anything I already knew. Having successfully pulled off my little stint, I couldn't contain the beaming grin on my face, which Russell even noticed when he handed me back my phone and laptop. I told him I was just excited about the opportunity and anxious to incorporate the information I attained to my paper. I rushed home and immediately uploaded the photos to my desktop. It was mid-December and snowed earlier that day, so the roads were really icy and prolonged my drive back to my apartment, so I got back really late. To my dismay, I only managed to take 4 pictures, 2 of which were too blurry, while another cut off the doll's head. You could vaguely see my reflection off the glass casing in the only clear photo I snapped, but it had to suffice. I could have prettied it up on Photoshop, but was really eager to post the image on my social media accounts. I first uploaded the picture of Emile onto my Instagram. In the caption, I wrote, "Probably the first of its kind, an actual photo of the real Emile doll." They said no photos, but I snuck one anyway, along with an obligatory litany of pertinent hashtags. I spent the next half hour constantly refreshing my phone and desktop to see how many people would like and comment, but the photo garnered 0 reactions. It was relatively late in a weeknight, so I decided to wait until tomorrow morning before posting it on my Twitter and Facebook. Emile the Doll was a popular topic of conversation among the young crowd, and a lot of my friends heard the stories or visited the exhibit, so I was certain I'd wake up to a swath of notifications. I spent most of the night transferring my notes onto my computer and working on my research paper. It wasn't due for another month, but I wanted to get a draft in for my professor to review before the final deadline. I wasn't sure how I'd incorporate my photo of Emile and actually became so consumed in my work, I forgot about my anxiousness over seeing people's reactions to my Instagram post of the doll. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I looked away from my desktop screen for the first time, sighing in displeasure at the overall lack of progress I'd made. I went to get myself a drink from the kitchen and passed by my roommate Adrian's bedroom, who still wasn't home from work. Adrian was a cook at a 24-hour diner in the next town over and typically worked late on weeknights, usually returning home anywhere from 1 till 4 a.m. I was eager to show him my photo of Emile since he was the one who initially told me about the story. Since he wasn't back yet, I decided to call it a night and start winding down. I finished saving my work when my phone, which was charging on the other side of the room, started ringing. I walked over to it and saw the name Sarah flashing on my screen, who is Adrian's girlfriend and also worked at the diner as a waitress. "You'll never guess what I pulled off today," I said enthusiastically when I answered, since Sarah also knew about Emile the Doll. There was a brief pause before she replied. "Darius?" Sarah said in a flat, shaky tone, which instantly formed a knot in my stomach. "Something happened tonight. Adrian. He's dead." My heart sank as my knees buckled. The news Sarah relayed felt like a high-speed train striking me head-on. "What? What do you mean? What the fuck happened?" I barely managed to utter. A vent collapsed on him and pinned his head into the fryer. His whole face got burned. I'm trying to deny it was Adrian because I couldn't even recognize him. His face was burned so badly. Darius, it was horrible. I was shaking uncontrollably, forcing myself to sit down since my legs could barely support me. "Where are you right now?" I quickly asked, taking slow, deep breaths, trying to regain my composure. "Are you still at the diner?" "I'm at your house. Can you let me in?" Sarah asked. "I'm coming down now." Glancing out of my living room window, I saw Sarah's car parked out front of the two-family duplex I lived in and rushed down the stairs. I froze before descending and I looked down at my phone once more, seeing I received a text message from Adrian about 40 minutes ago. When I read it, my blood ran cold. "Dude, how the fuck did you get that picture? Sarah gives you mad props." I leaned against the wall and slowly slid down it as I read Adrian's text, realizing he must have seen my Instagram post. Did I kill him? Did I cause this? No. It had to be a coincidence. The story, curse, whatever you want to call it, isn't real. It can't be. This is just some freak accident and nothing more. I snapped out of the whirlwind of contemplative thoughts when I heard a knock at the door. Sarah. I rushed down the stairs, not even bothering to flip on the lights, and swung the door open, finding Sarah standing on the front porch. She was still in her waitress uniform and her head was hanging down, but I could hear her sniffling. "Sarah," I said as I motioned for a hug, but she handed me something before I could embrace her. It was too dark to see in the doorway, but whatever Sarah put in my hand was ovular in shape with a stiff, leathery surface that had something warm and sticky coating the bottom. Asking what it was, Sarah said nothing as I felt for the light switch. When I flipped it on, I froze, seeing something dark red smeared around the light switch and the hand I used to flip it on covered in the same substance. I realized it was blood when I saw I was holding a flap of human skin, a face that I immediately recognized as Sarah's. Shrieking, I immediately dropped Sarah's skinned face and looked back up to see that she was nowhere to be seen. I glanced outside and saw Sarah lying face down at the foot of our stairs, a pool of dark red blood slowly forming around her head, with a thick dark red trail staining the snow that led up to Sarah's body from her car. My jaw hanging open, I was too terrified to speak and quickly spun to run back up the stairs, but walked right into someone standing closely behind me who tightly grabbed my shoulders. My widened eyes were met with the sight of a pale, blotchy, light beige face that lacked any features, but was littered with thick, dark red slits and scars. It wore a dark gray frock coat, pants and a white dress shirt and uttered 2 words in a deep, whispery voice that still echo in my mind as I write this. Destroy it. The lights in the stairwell went out and whatever stood in front of me vanished. I stood completely still for several minutes, despite the cold pouring in from outside. Only when my housemate occupying the lower unit stepped out onto the patio to see what was going on and reacted to seeing Sarah's body did I finally snap out of my fear-induced trance. The rest of the night was a blur. The police brought me in and interrogated me for hours. Although they acknowledged how traumatized I was, they were clearly skeptical when I recounted what I saw, but ultimately let me go, saying there wasn't enough evidence to charge me with anything. Yet. Those 2 words, destroy it, replayed in my mind throughout the entire ordeal, and upon exiting the police station, I pulled my phone out and shuddered at the influx of notifications from Instagram that filled my screen. When I checked the photo I posted of Emile, the naughty queasiness swiftly returned in my stomach. 44 likes, 22 comments, 19 reposts. I even received a few text messages from friends commenting on the photo, which I immediately deleted. I saw Russell even called and texted me, telling me to get back to him as soon as possible. When I called him back, it went straight to voicemail. Totally unaffected by the cold, I meandered down the sidewalk with my face buried in my phone, while I tried contemplating my options. When I returned home, I immediately destroyed the photos of Emile on my desktop and destroyed the spy pen, which was when I remembered Mrs. Barnes gave me her card after I spoke to her yesterday. Although I was apprehensive, it felt like I had no other choice but to call her. Mrs. Barnes' receptionist answered and said she was unavailable. When I told her who I was and emphasized it was an emergency, however, she told me to stay on the line while she got Mrs. Barnes. I know why you're calling, Darius. We're dealing with the consequences ourselves this very second, Mrs. Barnes said in an icy tone upon picking up. Someone showed Russell the photo of Emile you took and informed me immediately. Soon after, however, a chandelier he was walking under fell from the ceiling. His face was impaled by the pointed end at the bottom of it. I don't know what to do, I said in a stuttered response, barely able to hold the phone against my ear as I trembled. I didn't know who else to call. You have to help me. What can I do to stop this? Mrs. Barnes released a long sigh before she replied. I don't think you realize the severity of what you've done. Now that Emile's photo has been digitized, the consequences will be catastrophic. I deleted the photo from my Instagram, my desktop, destroyed the camera I used, I replied excitedly, a tone of desperation coating my voice. What's going to happen to anyone that's seen it? What's going to happen to me? Mrs. Barnes said nothing for a long time as I sat in anticipation of her response. The way I see it, Darius, your fate is sealed. Same goes for everyone who's seen that picture. There has to be something I can do, I said quickly, my heart pounding in anticipation of what she was about to say. It told me to destroy it, the picture last night, and I did. We were very successful at keeping any images of Emile from surfacing until you somehow took one last night. This is the first time anyone's recorded the doll in this day and age where something can be effortlessly shared online to thousands of people. Then why would you publicly display something that you knew was so dangerous? I angrily interjected. Emile likes to be seen, just not recorded. Even when it was in my possession, I had to display it at a prominent location in my house to keep it happy. You can only play by its rules, Darius. Give Emile what it wants to keep it happy. It's a cumbersome responsibility to take on, but must be done by someone to prevent it from unleashing the ferocity you unraveled, Mrs. Barnes sighed. Anyone who's previously photographed Emile, they were easy to contain. It would orchestrate their death and the pictures would be destroyed in the process, which is ultimately what it wants. You say you no longer have the photos, but what if others who saw your picture made their own copy? I felt myself get sicker as Mrs. Barnes' response processed in my mind and dreaded at thinking about the ramifications of my actions. These circumstances are different than what it's dealt with before, Darius. All the people who've laid eyes on that picture will keep it busy for now, but sooner or later, it will come back for you. I started to cry. Please, Mrs. Barnes, I pleaded in between sobs. There has to be something, anything I can do, anything you can think of, some way to defeat it, break this curse, unseal this fate. If it continues operating the way it has in the past, you doomed yourself the second you took that picture, Mrs. Barnes said gravely. You could try to track down any other copies that were made, but my guess is taking them all down would be impossible. It could, however, be a productive way to spend the time you have left until it comes back for you. Mrs. Barnes hung up after that, leaving me standing in the middle of my living room, sobbing with the phone still pressed against my ear. My phone has been getting flooded with texts, calls, and social media messages. I turn it off because I don't want to see how much of this curse, or whatever you want to call it, is spread. I'm sure as I type this, Emile, or whatever possesses that doll, is waging its ruthless effort to vanquish anyone who's seen its picture. The one I took. The only advice I can give is to avoid that picture of Emile the Doll at all costs. As for me, I wanted to type this up as my last plea. A final warning to try and raise awareness. It's all I can do while I sit around and wait for my inevitable demise, which I bestowed upon myself simply because I took a picture of Emile the Doll.